It's an honor and privilege to be with you this evening. My name's Kurt Older. I'm the author of Hood's Defeat Near Fox's Gap, Prelude to Emancipation. The book was published in April by Casemate Publishers. Before I begin my discussion about the book, at the end of this presentation, which should be in about 45 minutes, I'm going to make what I think is a shocking announcement about the battle at Turner's Gap. No other writer or author that I know of has written about what I'm about to disclose related to the battle at Turner's Gap. So that will be in about 45 minutes. Let's take a brief look at what research I've done in the past 35 years related to Fox's Gap. The Foxes were a family in my genealogy, and in 1996, my first book, which is a paperback, was The Braddock Expedition in Fox's Gap in Maryland. And that book, in my opinion, proves with beyond any doubt that General Braddock, George Washington, and half of Braddock's army passed through Fox's Gap in 1755 on their way to attack Fort Duquesne, which is the present site of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That road was known as the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road at that time. And there is some confusion about whether Braddock went through Fox's Gap or Turner's Gap, but the road through Turner's Gap dates to 1756, the year after the Braddock expedition. That was the new road to Fort Frederick, which is west of Williamsport, and that fort was built as a result of Braddock's defeat in 1755. My second book was The Land Tracks of the Battlefield of South Mountain. That appeared in 1999. It's also a paperback book, 8.5 by 11. And that includes about 320 land records related to the battlefield of South Mountain, encompassing Turner's, Fox's, and also Crampton's Gap. And those land tracks trace the initial settlers on the battlefield area, and they also trace all the way from the earliest settler up to, say, the United States government that owns the Reno Monument, the owners of the Mountain House there at Turner's Gap, also the Fox Inn, which is about 2 miles east of Fox's Gap, and some other locations on the battlefield. The third book that I published was in 2018. It's 484 pages and would not be of much interest to most people because it deals with the Fox genealogy, but I was very fortunate to run across a fellow by the name of Kurt Graham, and he allowed me to first publish 4 or 5 articles on Drayton's battery or Drayton's brigade in the battle at Fox's Gap. And if you're interested in learning about Drayton's brigade at Fox's Gap and the Battle of South Mountain, I would urge you to start with these articles by Kurt Graham that are enclosed in this book. They're just outstanding, fabulous research by Kurt Graham. All of my research has tried to focus on what I call primary source evidence, and a good book to reference related to writing documentation or proofs of whatever it is that you're dealing with in your book, if you're writing a book, or if you're the reader of a book, is a book by Elizabeth Shown Mills called Evidence, Citation, and Analysis for the Family Historian. And in that book, she has several lists. And for example, under documentation, she states any statement of fact that is not common knowledge must carry its own individual statement of source, or you must have a reference for it. So if you're reading a Civil War book or you're writing a Civil War book, you need to reference or bring into question, if there is no reference for what you're reading, who is claiming to make this statement about this battle. And that's a very important point, and we'll get into that in just a moment here. The second area that she has in a list is related to analyzing evidence. And I think this is very important when you're reading or writing a book about the Civil War battles. The most reliable informants have firsthand knowledge of the events to which they testify. So in other words, if you're reading something about a battle and they don't tell you who is making this statement and that they were in the battle themselves, then you ought to question or at least have some reservations about the legitimacy of that statement. Ezra Carman was not in the Battle of South Mountain. He was in Antietam. He was a historian in Antietam, but he is not a primary source of evidence for the Battle of South Mountain. I wanted to go ahead and point that out. Now, what motivated me to write Hood's defeat near Fox's Gap? I must confess that I had no intention of ever writing a book about a Civil War battle. Related to the Battle of South Mountain, there are probably at least 12 books, if not more, that have been written since shortly after the Civil War, and I had no idea that I could ever add anything to what had been written by all of these other authors. But over the years, I picked up bits and pieces about the battle because I did have some interest in learning about it. And I found no primary source evidence in the writings of Carman, Dr. Harsh, and others to support their claim that Hood and his two brigades attacked in the area of the Wise Cabin, or on the north side of the road across from the Reno Monument, the area that I call Miller's Field. It's also called by some the 17th Michigan Field. And if you look at these authors that have written about that event occurring, they give no references whatsoever. And I would say they'll never have a reference for it because it never happened. Now, related to the death of General Reno there at Fox's Gap, virtually every writer will contend that it was some member of Hood's two brigades that advanced along Wood Road, came down from Turner's Gap down Wood Road to near Fox's Gap, and somebody in Hood's troops shot and killed General Reno. Well, there's three primary sources. I'm a citizen of the state of North Carolina, so some of the library material here obviously relates to the North Carolina troops in the battle. And I found three primary sources that provide evidence that a soldier in the 23rd North Carolina, which was not under General Hood's command during the battle, somebody in the 23rd North Carolina shot Reno. And actually, one of those sources named the Confederate soldier that killed Reno. So my own opinion is that's legitimate. A soldier in the 23rd North Carolina killed Reno, and I just don't see anything to show that one of Hood's troops shot General Reno. The third point that I'm going to get into here in a second is a critical point. Dr. Harsh indicates that Union General Jacob Dolson Cox, who was the Union commander there at Fox's Gap throughout the day, had no plan or objective in carrying out the battle. Well, I'd used General Cox to reference some of this information about Braddock and Washington going through Fox's Gap during the Braddock expedition in 1755. So I went back again and I started rereading what Jacob Dolson Cox had to say about the battle. And this quote really motivated me to dig deeper into the legitimacy of whether or not Hood's troops actually recaptured some of the territory lost there near Fox's Gap in what I call Miller's Field. And Jacob Dolson Cox says on the left, which would have been the west, Longstreet's men were pushed down the mountainside beyond the Roarsville and Sharpsburg roads, and the contest there was ended. Now, Cox doesn't tell us that these troops on the Confederate side at this location were under Hood, but he does tell us that the battle is ending a half-mile west of Fox's Gap, which contradicts virtually everyone that has written about the battle. And so if we look at this map here, this is from the Atlas map that was created by the federal government about 1872 of the battlefields. We have Turner's Gap here on the Old National Pike. Coming down Wood Road about 1 mile, we hit Fox's Gap. And then the two roads identifying the intersection where Cox tells us the battle ended is a half a mile west over here. And that intersection is presently the roads that are called Moser Road on the north side between the Old National Pike and the Old Sharpsburg Road. And then on the south, once you cross the Old Sharpsburg Road, or today it's the Reno Monument Road, it becomes Park Hall Road. So this intersection, which I have labeled as Cox's intersection, is where the Union general who was in command of the army the entire day indicates the battle ended a good half mile west of Fox's Gap. Now, we don't know at that point who's there as far as the Confederate side. Could be Hood, it could be others. Looking at the land records, which is something I like to investigate, my four great grandfather, Frederick Fox, had this track patented in 1805. The Fox family all moved to near Miamisburg, Ohio in 1807, and there were no more foxes at Fox's Gap after that time. But the mountain house sits on a tract of land called Flanham that is surrounded by part of this addition to Friendship Track. The northern portion of this addition to Friendship Track is going to be on the east side of Turner's Gap and where most of the Battle of Turner's Gap was fought. And then down at Fox's Gap, this W in the red circle represents the location of the Wise House, which was the focal point of the battle there at Fox's Gap. And then Frederick Fox owned most of the land on the southeast side, and a lot of the battle was conducted there. And then, of course, connecting the two larger sections is what became Wood Road. Wood Road actually went around the Flanham track. Today it goes directly up towards the mountain house. So that's how you got Wood Road and actually the Appalachian Trail today. Now, I contacted Stephen Stanley, who creates a lot of battlefield maps for the, I believe it's the American Battlefield Trust, and I paid him a small sum to overlay this edition of Friendship Track on one of his battlefield maps. And this happens to be a map that Stephen Stanley has created showing what he believes is the situation of the battle between 4 and 5 p.m. And as you can see, he has Hood coming down what's affectionately known by most writers as Wood Road. And Hood's going to attack into this area here near Fox's Gap, supposedly, according to all the other authors, and recapture some of this land. And as part of that discussion, I think you can impute, or perhaps these other writers actually say, the Union Army is going to go up Wood Road and attack the Confederates there at Turner's Gap. That really doesn't constitute the definition of a flank attack. But I don't have time to go into it, but there's virtually no way the Union Army could pursue an attack north along Wood Road. They never intended to do that, and we'll mention the Union objective here in a couple of moments. Now, something I didn't really stress much in my book, this is a small section of the Atlas map. You can see Fox's Gap here in this upper left-hand corner. Wood Road is this section coming down from Turner's Gap, and then 120 feet or 40 yards to the right is the Upper Ridge Road. And so those two roads intersect here at Fox's Gap. But if you look on the Atlas map, Durell's battery is clearly shown in this location and is supported by primary source evidence. Got this little red circle here. There were actually two ladies. I just found this out recently. There were two ladies that lived in one of these cabins. They stayed in their cabin in the cellar throughout the battle. And of course, they were scared to death. But my main point is here, we're going to back out of this picture and look at it from a higher elevation. Durell's guns are focused right there on Wood Road. So if we back up, this dark blue line is where Durell's battery of 6 guns were. They're right behind a fence here that separated that field from the trees. And you can see those 6 guns are aiming right up to the northwest, and I have Wood Road identified with this red line. Now, there's also 6 Union guns under different captains, one of which is John Coffin, who has 2 guns in this area somewhere. I'm not sure I can identify exactly where they were at, but they were, as best we know, somewhere around this Wise's Field track on the south side. And so between these 6 guns with the identification here in the turquoise light blue and the 6 guns of Durell in the dark blue, I don't see how there's any way that any Confederates could have come up here, because the Union troops in this area probably amount to 3,000 or 4,000 infantry besides these 12 guns. So that's another argument that I think is going to be hard for anybody to ever overcome about Hood taking any land in that area. But we need to learn some things about the mountain and about the Union objective, which other authors do not tell you in their writings. This battle was not fought on a flat piece of land or something like a tabletop. It's on a very brutal mountain. I hiked from Turner's Gap to Fox's Gap, right down this east crest somewhat, and it is a brutal mountain to pass over. But one point that the other authors don't identify and is critical to identifying where Hood and his troops were on this battlefield is a point called the Crest of the Heights. That's the highest point on what's today Moser Road. Moser Road starts here about 1,300 feet west of the mountain house at Turner's Gap, and it is at an elevation there at the Old National Pike of about 1,000 feet. The crest is about 1,100 feet. Then it drops 400 feet approximately to come down to the foot of the mountain, which is here where Moser Road meets today's Reno Monument Road or the Old Sharpsburg Road and Cox's intersection. So Cox's intersection is the bottom of the mountain if you're coming down from the crest of the heights. Likewise, if you're coming down the mountain to the west from Fox's Gap, you're dropping from about 1,000-foot elevation down to this 700, 720-foot elevation. So whether you're coming west along the Old Sharpsburg Road or coming south along Moser Road, you're coming down to the foot of the mountain. There's a view of the crest of the heights that I took this past summer. Moser Road is here on the left. That's the crest of the heights. I'm on the north side looking south. I've just come off the Old National Turnpike, Old National Pike, and I'm looking south along Moser Road here to the crest of the heights. Off to the right here, you can see it's out of the picture, but you start building up to 1,200 feet to what I call hill number one. So this whole crest across here from left to right is critical from a military standpoint, or would have been during the battle. Now, the second point that the other authors don't mention, and mainly they don't mention it because they don't include it in part of the battle, but it was the West Ridge. And Ezra Carbon mentions two ridges, an East Ridge and a West Ridge, north of the Old National Pike, which runs through Turner's Gap. But there's also these two ridges on the south side between the Old National Pike and down here, the road through Cox's intersection, Reno Monument Road or the Old Sharpsburg Road. Now, this West Ridge, the main point is this, what I call hill number one, which is about 1,200, 1,220 feet. It tapers down then once again to this area along Reno Monument Road, which is about 700 feet. But just to hopefully prove to you that there are two ridges, a friend of mine in Sharpsburg that knew this mountain like the back of his hand, he's drawn this white line here, which is along the crest of the East Ridge. The East Ridge runs from Turner's Gap down to Fox's Gap. If you look out a mile to the west, you can faintly see in this photograph there is a West Ridge that's out there, but it's about a mile away. So the East Crest from Turner's to Fox's Gap, and then the West Crest, those two ridges or crests are separated by Moser Road. And Moser Road is going to go right down between those two crests. Now, the other thing that I don't believe the other authors adequately identify, if they identify at all, is the Union objective in this battle, which is critical to understanding really the whole operation of the Union Army. And the other authors either directly or indirectly indicate that the Union Army was going to go north along Wood Road and attack at Turner's Gap. That was never the objective of the Union Army. To find the objectives of the Union Army, you need to look at Union Cavalry Brigadier General Alfred Pleasonton. He and General Cox get together at about 8 a.m. in the morning of the battle, and they agree on the plan of attack. Pleasonton tells the reader in his either in his official report or somewhere that he's recorded. Let me go back there. I also learned that there were two roads, one on the right or north side of the turnpike and the other to the left or south of the gap or turnpike road through Turner's Gap. Now, if you just stop at that point and aren't careful, and you know anything about the area there, you think he's talking about the old Hagerstown Road and the old Sharpsburg Road. Both of these roads, the old Hagerstown Road and the old Sharpsburg Road, just as you get onto the west side of Middletown, the old Hagerstown Road branches off to the north and runs all the way up, obviously, to Hagerstown. The Sharpsburg Road branches off to the south, passes through Fox's Gap, and never enters the turnpike. It goes west to Keedysville and Sharpsburg. So what are the two roads Pleasanton is talking about? Well, he tells us in the continuation of his statement, both of these roads enter the turnpike road through Turner's Gap beyond or west of Turner's Gap, and they would assist the Union materially in turning the enemy's position on both flanks. So the roads he's talking about are Zeidelstown Road and Moser Road. Those two roads are going to connect with the turnpike just west of Turner's Gap. The Mountain House is right here in this area. This is Wood Road coming down to Fox's Gap here a mile to the south. And about 1,300 feet west of the Mountain House, you have the intersection with Moser Road and the Old National Pike. And then here's Zeidelstown Road, even farther west from the Mountain House, where the Union Army has their objective of reaching these two intersections. These two, or this road here, the Old National Pike, descends through a valley in this area. You can see hill number one here that's at about 1,200 feet. And then on the north side of the Old National Pike, you've got another hill here, probably 1,200, 1,300 feet. So if the Union Army can capture either of these intersections, the Union or the Confederates have no way of escape because Cox is down here at the Moser Road intersection, which I call Cox's intersection, about a half mile west of Fox's Gap. And he has cut off any route of escape of the Confederates coming south on Moser Road and then either going west again, along the old Sharpsburg Road to Sharpsburg or going south along Park Hall Road to Roarsville and reuniting with some of the Confederates at Crampton's Gap or farther south at Harper's Ferry. So once the Union Army and the Ninth Corps under Cox take this intersection, the only route of escape for the Confederates is from Turner's Gap along the Old National Pike down to Boonesboro. And the Union Army is almost successful during the battle in doing this. Hooker's troops, mainly the ones under Meade and Seymour, capture this hill, which is called Hill 1500 by Hartwig. That's its elevation. They come down, and they're somewhere in this area, 200 or 300 yards north of this Moser Road intersection. There's also some confusion as to Cox not going up Moser Road, but Cox tells us that he's not going to advance until Hooker takes the Mountain House. Cox has his eye on going north along this road and also perhaps capturing what are probably some Confederate cannon here on hill number one, but he doesn't do so because Hooker has not quite captured the Mountain House at the end of the day. Now, the objective of my book is essentially to try to prove where did Hood attack. And so, again, we're going to look at another map, this one by Brad Gottfried. And here he shows G.T. Anderson on Hood's left flank, protecting Hood's left flank. And then Hood's two brigades under Law and Wofford have come down Wood Road, marched into position of a line of battle, and then they've attacked here at Fox's at this along Wood Road, just north of the Reno Monument, where the Reno Monument ends up being built. And they supposedly recapture some of this area of Miller's Field, and also they've prevented the Union Army from going north along Wood Road. Well, the Union Army is never going to go north along Wood Road. I don't think it was possible. I don't have time to get into an explanation of it, but just the geography is extremely brutal. But also in this picture, you can see Durrell has 4 guns here in this map. This is along Fox Gap Road, which is about an elevation of 700 feet above sea level. Wood Road is roughly about 1,000 foot elevation, almost all the way from Fox's Gap to Turner's. So if you go east from Wood Road down to Fox Gap Road, you're dropping about 300 feet. There's not going to be any battle on the east side of Wood Road because the ground is just impassable. You can't go up an elevation of 300 feet. And if you're trying to come down, you better be hanging onto a tree. Uh, but this never happened. Hood is over here in this area, which we're going to identify shortly. Once again, Durrell is up in this area on the east side of this open field. There's two guns by John Coffin. His section of Union guns are in here. We've also got Glassy. Cook is in here, which I think he's probably moved over here. So there's most likely 6 guns in this area, and we definitely can identify Chrome as being on the east side of this field. Now, we're going to look here at Confederate Brigadier General Roswell Ripley, and he's going to identify, it's a critical primary source of evidence. He's going to identify where Brigadier General Hood is on the battlefield. Roswell Ripley, Confederate, tells us his brigade moves up to within a short distance of the crest of the heights, which we have identified previously here on our map. And his brigade holds its position under a noisy but comparatively harmless fire. And it's because at this point of the battlefield, he's sort of taken his men out of the battle. And he's criticized by General Hill of the Confederates for doing this. But at the same time, I think he's holding this critical ridge here between hill number 1 and hill number 2. So his brigade under Ripley's brigade is just somewhere in this area south of the crest of the heights. And how he got there was that he was initially at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was down here on the east side of the Old National or the Old Sharpsburg Road, east of the Cox's intersection. And he tries to move south and ultimately has the aim of recapturing over here to the east some of this ridge road that was lost in the morning. But when he moves south of the Old Sharpsburg Road, he runs into some more Confederates under G.B. Anderson that are on the left side over here, and then also G.T. Anderson, who's lined up this way, and apparently they all sort of start colliding here. They lose their bearing in that confusing geography of that battlefield. So Ripley takes his men back to this old Sharpsburg Road here, and then shortly advances north along what is today's Moser Road and ends up in this position. So he's in this area, and he goes on to tell us soon after he's at the crest of the heights, or near the crest, Brigadier General Hood's command came from the main pass, which he's talking about Turner's Gap. And Hood, forming upon Ripley's left or east, Ripley's facing south, so his left would be east. Hood's troops pressed up the road, or we could say down the road, Moser Road, driving the enemy before him. So what's he saying? Ripley is in this area here, just south of the crest of the heights. He looks to his left, which would be east, towards hill number 2, and he sees Hood's troops forming in that area. Now, hill number 2 is at 1,220 feet roughly. The crest of the heights at its highest point is probably 1,100. So Hood's troops essentially have to get over onto the west side of this east ridge that goes down from hill number 2 onto Fox's Gap. There's no way that Ripley could be on what's today Moser Road and look over and see over the crest of the East Ridge and down to Wood Road, which is at an elevation of about 1,000 feet. That would be simply impossible. So Ripley's telling us that Hood has come into this area near this S section of today's Moser Road. They advance up the road, or I could term it down the road, pushing the Union troops back. Now, the troops that the Union have in this area are just some skirmishers that have come north from this area of Cox's intersection, and probably have just advanced maybe 400 or 500 feet at most north of the road, trying to figure out if there's any Confederates in that area. Now, if we look at the rest of Ripley's statement, he says Hood's troops advance until the Union troops occupy their first position and the darkness puts an end to the operations. So he's telling us that the Union troops fall back to their first position, which is unknown, but it's obviously along this road here, which is Moser Road today. And if you accepted that it was here at Cox's intersection, then Ripley is telling us the battle ended here at Cox's intersection, the same as General Cox, and he's also identified the troops as being Hood's troops. But that's not conclusive proof. I don't have the time to go through all the points of my book, but there's two questions which we must be able to answer, and we can answer affirmatively in both. Can we place Union troops at Cox's intersection? And can we place Hood's troops there? Well, Ripley is certainly telling us that they're probably in that area. So let's look at the Union troops that end up being there at Cox's intersection. And to prove who was there, we look at Union Captain James Wren of the 48th Pennsylvania. He tells us just to the right of his skirmish line of yesterday. He's saying this on Monday, the 15th, the day after the battle, just to the right of where he was the day of the battle, there were two crossroads in the shape of an X. Now we'll just stop reading his statement at that point and see if we can identify what he's talking about. Virtually all the other authors contend that Wren and the 48th Pennsylvania are up here at Fox's Gap. We have Wood Road coming down here, meeting the old Sharpsburg Road, 120 feet west of what is today the Reno Monument Road, which is right there next to the Upper Ridge Road. Now, how do I know that's 40 yards or 120 feet? Well, Ezra Carman tells us, whether he went over there to Fox's Gap himself or he had somebody do it, Ezra Carman tells us in his writings the distance between the Wood Road intersection and the Ridge Road intersection with the old Sharpsburg Road, the distance between those two intersections is 40 yards, 120 feet. I do agree with Ezra Carman with that statement. I don't have time to prove how I come up with that, but that's 120 feet. And to my way of thinking, that doesn't look like an X. So let's do something. Let's advance from Fox's Gap over here on the right along the old Sharpsburg Road, Reno Monument Road today, and go over here to the left. And behold, what have we got? This is Moser Road today, Park Hall Road on the south, where they cross the old Sharpsburg Road or Reno Monument Road today. That looks like an X to me. I'm sorry. But I contend that's where Captain Wren and his regiment was, the 48th Pennsylvania. Wren also tells us, and I'm quoting here, on our front, there was a stone fence. And he tells us behind that stone fence and in the crossroad, that X road that we just identified, the enemy lay very thick. And indeed they were. So I don't have a great deal of time to explain how we came to find this. I never thought that I was going to find anything about any particular significance that was not already known, but this photograph is an aerial that was taken, we think, about 2017. It's on a Maryland state website, and off to the right corner here, you see Moser Road today coming down, intersecting Reno Monument Road here, and then on the south side, we have Park Hall Road that goes on down to Roarsville. Now, this doesn't look like an X today as much as it did at the time of the battle. So this intersection has been modified a little bit. You can see this white area here. This is probably concrete. I guess I would call it a viaduct. Dog Creek comes down the west side of Moser Road, goes under the road now at this viaduct, goes under the road and then comes down here and follows along Park Hall Road away. And then it meanders out and crosses about in this area. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. And lo and behold, we see this dark black line, which we never thought we were going to discover this fence. We figured that the fence was the stone fence that Wren has talked about is along or was along the old Sharpsburg Road. But from this overhead, we identify this long black line here, and my friend Ted Ellis tells me I want to go out and take a look at this. And once we identify this as Wren's Wall, Ted asked me, well, how do we know that wall was there at the time of the battle? Well, it's the same with any wall up there at Fox's Gap. How do we know any of those walls were there at the time of the battle? But I can tell you this, looking into the land records in this upper left-hand corner, there is a line in a land record that runs south 41 degrees east, 18 perches, which is 297 feet, about the length of a football field. And from what we can tell, we think that that line in that deed is pretty much parallel with what we call Wren's Wall, which runs from Park Hall Road over here to what we believe is Dog Creek. We haven't marched along there because we didn't really want to be trespassing on somebody else's land. The other thing Ted Ellis asked me is, why isn't the wall on the property line? Well, it may be. We simply don't know. I don't have $2,000 or $3,000 to hire a surveyor to go out there and tell me if the wall, Wren's Wall, is on this line of the deed or whether the line on the deed's separate and parallel. But if it was my fence and I wanted to control it and keep ownership, I wouldn't put it on the property line. But I can tell you there were other deeds around the time of the battle that match this line, and the latest deed that matches this line, south 41 degrees east, 18 perches, that's pretty parallel and same length of this wall. The latest deed was 1977. So we think that that was the greatest discovery made on the battlefield in the last 160 years. Some people have said, well, there's lots of stone walls in that area, and that just happens to be one. Well, there's not lots of stone walls. The only other stone walls you're going to find within a half a mile are up there at Fox's Gap. Now, the only time you're going to be able to see Wren's Wall is going to be when the vegetation has dried up. And so Ted Ellis went up and took a picture here. This was on February 23rd, 2023. So you can see this wall is along here. It's almost the length of a football field. Somebody's house, I guess the owner of this property, is up here in this northeast corner, but this is about 600 feet back from the intersection. And there's a lot of dead Confederates along this wall. There's a lot of dead Confederates in this entire area. As a matter of fact, there's 105 dead Confederates in that area. Now, we can learn other things about Hood's advance, and some of that information comes from Robert Coles, a lieutenant in the 4th Alabama, which was they were in one of Hood's 2 brigades under Law and Wofford. Robert Coles tells us that after they reached Turner's Gap, the 4th Alabama, his unit receives orders to attack the Union on the left or north side of the old National Pike. They're at Turner's Gap. Well, they're not there very long, and word comes that the Confederates on the Fox's Gap battlefield are being driven back. So Coles tells us that soon afterward, we marched to the right, which would be the south. So he's going south of the old National Pike, heading towards the old Sharpsburg Road. And he says they marched through an orchard, the trees growing among huge boulders. And they don't have time to stop to eat a single apple. So we know he's going through an apple orchard. So can we prove that? Well, if you look at the Atlas map, it shows troops under General Longstreet along what is today Dahlgren Road. At the time of the battle, it was the road to, it escapes me. Rent's farm, I think. He lived just to the right here. But this is Dahlgren Road today, and the Confederate troops under Longstreet, when they arrive at Turner's Gap, they march out along this road. And I'm assuming these first troops along the road are probably the 2 brigades that Hood decides to take south towards the old Sharpsburg Road. So if you look here, when they cross this road, you see this dotted line down here. It's almost forming a rectangle, and it's around the mountain house. The mountain house is that big black dot there. So this is the orchard that Coles tells us the 4th Alabama marches through when they cross from Dahlgren Road across the old National Pike and start marching south. Now, how do we know that that's an orchard? Well, if you look at these dots inside that map, inside that fence, These dots are in nice parallel rows here, east, west, and north, south, compared to these dots that are outside the fence that are just all random. And I asked Ted Ellis if he had a chance, if he could stop up there at the Appalachian Trail parking lot near the mountain house and walk back in there about 200 or 300 feet and let me know if he saw any boulders. Well, yes, there's boulders in that area. Now, let's look at what General Hood actually says, because after all, we're trying to prove where General Hood's troops are. And this is the second time that he's going to tell us that he bore still more obliquely to the right. Now, we know he's moving south, so it's obliquely to the right, which would mean that he's going southwest. You couldn't go southeast because you would go down from Wood Road to Fox Gap Road, and that would be impassable. Now, he also tells us, and this is critical, that he's intending to get as far as possible towards the enemy's, the Union's left flank or west, before he comes into contact. He also tells us he marched through the wood as rapidly as the obstacles in his passage would admit, which tells us that he's not on Wood Road. There were no obstacles or trees on Wood Road. Some of the Confederate cannon under Bondurant for sure came down Wood Road from Turner's Gap to Fox's Gap. So Wood Road was a passable road. The other thing all these other authors are never going to point out is there's a big boulder field that stretches roughly from this east crest, I don't know, 700, 800 feet south of the mountain house, almost down to Wood Road. And we know that Hood is on a horse because he tells us so, because he's going to ride back to the mountain house at the end of the battle and find out what's going on with the rest of the Confederates. Ted Ellis and I both feel that there would be no way that you could get off your horse and even walk it through this boulder field. The horse is going to break his legs, and you'd be lucky yourself. If I have walked through this area, but I was probably not too smart to do so. But there's a lot of rocks in there. Some of them are the size of automobiles. So Hood has come through this orchard here, and he says he's moving obliquely to the right, which would be southwest. And he probably had skirmishers out in front of his advance, and they probably were able to find this fairly level area, nice open area to walk through to get over here to where they are seen in this area east of this S in Mazza Road by General Ripley. So Hood's going to form up in this area here, south of the crest of the heights, west of the East Ridge, west of this boulder field, and advance. I don't really think too many of his troops went down Moser Road. Some of them obviously were, but they were probably more on the right side. To the left side of this road, there's a drop off of 20 or 30 feet immediately west of this road here. So I see them more or less on the road or to the right side of the road advancing south. Now this is where everybody goes wrong, except me. I hate to say that, but anyway, Hood tells us the night closed in, or the battle finishes with the nighttime coming on, with not only our dead and wounded together with those of our adversary in our possession, and here's where it goes wrong, but with the mountain on the right within our lines. Everyone reads this last section, the mountain on the right within our lines, as being the East Crest, because they're imputing into this sentence a couple of words which Hood doesn't put there. He actually said, with the mountain on the right within our lines. What everyone else does, all the other authors, and it's easy to do this, they impute into Hood's statement that he's saying the mountain on the right flank, the Confederate right flank within our lines. That would mean, and essentially, the East Crest. That's not what he's saying. He's west of the East Crest, and what he should have said, which would have clarified this, and we wouldn't have had this confusion about this battle if he would have said, with the mountain on my right within our lines. So Once again, Hood is in this area where General Ripley sees him. He's crossed over this east crest, and now he's coming down Moser Road. What's Moser Road today? This road was in there about 1851. I don't know that anybody lived along it at the time of the battle, maybe shortly after, but Hood's in this area advancing probably down the road and on the east side of the road. And so he's in this area here. So if he's looking south, what's the mountain on his right? It's over here. It's hill number 1, West Ridge. He's trying to defend this crest because he's obviously been able to see from when he came up to Turner's Gap the importance of that area. And then obviously when he gets into this area advancing south, he can see that that crest is important to hold. So he's already on the west side of the East Ridge. If he's going south, he's intending to refer to this mountain on his right. So that's where 160 years of confusion has come in. Now, I could have spent a lot more time, I think. I just spent about 4 or 5 pages discussing Abraham Lincoln's issuance of his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was on September 22nd. Obviously, between September 14th, the date of the Battle of South Mountain, and September 22nd, you have the Battle of Antietam. And Antietam, and everybody that writes about it, claims that that was the reason Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. I don't believe that's true. And my argument is Lincoln needed a Union victory in the East. The Union Army, under various generals, had lost its first Bull Run, second Bull Run. The Peninsula Campaign turned into a disaster. The only thing that was favorable to the Union was General Grant in the West, and the West was sort of out in the boondocks compared to most people that lived on the East Coast in the major cities like New York, Washington, Philadelphia, etc. So Lincoln was looking for a victory, and that I think I make a pretty good argument in my afterword about that. So at this point, let me wrap up here. In 1755, George Washington, along with General Braddock, passes through Fox's Gap on the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road. They cross the Potomac. Braddock and Washington cross at Swearengen's Ferry and advance through West Virginia towards the battle there of the Monongahela in 1755. Half of Braddock's army march up to Williamsport and then cross the Potomac there and join Washington's army. And Braddock in what became West Virginia. So George Washington went through Fox's Gap. I think he also went through there about 1789 when he was president or just left the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes was wounded there at Fox's Gap, about a half mile south at the start of the battle. William McKinley was in the battle. Both Hayes and McKinley were in the 23rd Ohio troops. And then Abraham Lincoln comes out there when he's inspecting the battlefields of Harper's Ferry, Antietam, Fox's and Turner's Gaps, and he also went through Crampton's Gap between October 1st and October 1st. So October 5th. So I have Abraham Lincoln there at Fox's Gap on October 5th. Now, what I'd like to see is a couple of historical markers. There's almost nothing on the battlefield at Fox's Gap except the Reno Monument. The Confederates lost a lot more in the way of dead soldiers on the Fox's Gap battlefield than anybody has ever accounted for. In this triangular area here along Old Sharpsburg Road, Park Hall Road, and this wood fence here, the morning after the battle, a Union soldier goes out and counts the Confederate dead in this area, and he gets 105. There's a lot more Confederate dead at this intersection. I don't have time to go into that. Whether I'll be able to come up with the names, I don't know. But if we could have a drum roll here, I'm going to make what to me is a shocking revelation. I just found this out in the last 4 or 5 months about the battle there at Turner's Gap. I had never read this before in any of books. I haven't read all of them completely, but Union artillery hit the Mountain House with 2 cannon shells there near the end of the battle. The first cannon shell was put into the Mountain House on the 2nd floor, to scare the Confederates that were on the second floor. And then a few moments later, as they were supposedly running down to the first floor, the Union artillery put a second shell into the mountain house on the first floor. So I don't know if anybody has ever said that. I think that I've got solid primary source evidence to prove that point. So that's the end of my prepared marks. We're ready for questions and comments. And I'll put up this slide here. This was a little quote by Orlando Wilcox, who was in the battle for the Union Army. I had a friend of mine draw this and put this quote on there. But at the end of the battle, there's this Confederate musician, young boy who's dead, who's sitting on the fence there at Fox's Gap with his arm extended. And anyway, that wraps up my presentation of Hood's defeat near Fox's Gap. Thank you.